Are you ready? Are you ready to start the meeting? Are you happy to start?
Yes, I think we can start if you're ready to go ahead.
Sure. Great. I'm ready to start. Thank you.
Okay, perfect.
Afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Hematology Deep Dive. I am Jackie Hall. I am head of the Division of Consultation Liaison Psychiatry at UCT and Groote Hospital. I'll be chairing this afternoon's session, and it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Heidi Mattison. Heidi is a philosopher in the ethics lab at the NI. The central theme of Dr. Mattison's work is to think and enact care in the context of academia. As a philosopher, this means conceptualizing and understanding care as an essential component of what makes us human. As an academic teacher, this means thinking deeply about how to structure a bioethics curriculum so that students have optimal opportunities for learning and development, whilst also being supported to make sense of the ethics of our world. As a bioethicist, this means advocating for the integration of perspectives from care ethics into how we think about and address ethical challenges. It also means working alongside healthcare providers to understand the importance of care in building ethical resilience. There are a few housekeeping rules, if that slide can just be drawn up. Although I'm sure, as I'm new to this meeting, most of you know a lot more about this than I do. But if you could have a quick look at the housekeeping rules. Before I hand over to Heidi, who will be talking to us about moral distress and moral resilience. Thank you. Heidi, are you ready to start?
I am. Thanks, Jackie. Let me just share my slides. Okay, I'm hoping everyone can hear and see the slides. I'm not going to put the camera on just because there are a lot of us on here and we're going to save bandwidth that way, but I'll put it on afterwards. Thank you for inviting me back to the Hematology Deep Dive and to everyone for attending today's session. I'm especially grateful, Jackie, not only for your introduction and chairing of the session, but more importantly, and particularly in the context of this session, for sensitizing me to the fact that, as Jackie puts it, moral distress is the primary occupational hazard for medicine today. Together, she, Jantine de Vries, who is the director of the Ethics Lab, and I are trying to find ways to respond to this phenomenon of moral distress. And so I look forward to hearing your thoughts, all of your thoughts about the subject in the discussion later on. There are a range of terms that are used to describe the experience of what we're talking about. These include moral distress, moral harm, moral injury, and moral burnout. In the context of medicine, some even speak of moral warfare. But the term moral distress originated in the field of healthcare, specifically nursing. It was initially conceptualized and defined by American ethicists Jamerton and Boss in 1984 as a psychological and emotional response experienced by healthcare professionals when they believe they know the morally right course of action, but are unable to act accordingly due to various constraints, such as institutional policies, hierarchical structures, legal and ethical dilemmas, or conflicting values within a healthcare setting. Jamerton later refined the concept, explaining moral distress as the psychological distress of being in a situation in which one is constrained from acting on what one knows to be right. It is the experience of being seriously compromised as a moral agent in practicing in accordance with accepted professional and personal values and standards. Another simpler way of describing moral distress is knowing what the right thing to do is, but being or feeling unable to do it. A sister concept to moral distress is moral injury, defined in 1995 by Shea as being present when there has been a betrayal of what is morally right by someone who holds the legitimate authority and in a high-stakes situation. While moral injury was originally studied in the context of Vietnam soldiers' experiences of PTSD, it has more recently been applied to the healthcare setting, specifically in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, with its significant impacts on healthcare systems and healthcare providers. While moral distress is more about being unable to act in line with one's morals, moral injury involves actual moral transgressions and often leads to profound emotional and psychological suffering. As Kartalovny and colleagues argue, moral injury is unique to those who bear witness to intense human suffering. But whether it is moral distress or moral injury, individuals experiencing these are generally at a higher risk of developing chronic physical and emotional exhaustion, as well as a sense of reduced accomplishment, typically resulting from prolonged exposure to high levels of stress and job demands. That is, they may experience symptoms of burnout, malaise, fatigue, frustration, cynicism, and inefficacy that arise from making excessive demands on energy, strength, or resources in the workplace. Now, a host of studies have shown the physical and mental effects of moral distress and injury. They not only negatively affect the healthcare provider, but directly and indirectly affect the efficiency and quality of healthcare delivery. Studies have found a causal relationship between moral distress and job performance, burnout and workplace attrition, and ultimately, and most concerningly, patient care. Now, although moral distress can be caused by internal constraints, such as lack of ethical reasoning skills, lack of confidence to raise our voices in ethically challenging situations, much of the focus of the literature of moral distress is on external constraints, resource scarcity, unsupportive institutional environments, or as in our country, violence and inequality, and the effects these have on the healthcare system. That is, given the suffering South Africans as a population group experience, it is no wonder that as of 2023, South Africa is the most stressed or distressed country out of 64 surveyed. When we focus on clinicians and healthcare providers specifically, the problem is compounded. In 2022, South Africa's doctor-to-patient ratio was 0.31 per 1,000, a decrease from 2019, where the ratio was 0.79 per 1,000. There is also a critical lack of nurses in the country, with only 22,090 nurses, a ratio of 1 nurse for every 2,300 people, and a significant number set to retire in the next 10 years. It is estimated that there will be a shortage of between 131,000 and 166,000 nurses by 2030. It is no wonder then that according to the Medical Protection Society survey released in October last year, more than a third of healthcare practitioners in South Africa say their mental well-being is worse now than it was during the COVID-19 pandemic. And 39% of those surveyed said the impact of burnout and exhaustion on patient safety was impacting their own mental well-being. A quarter of the participants were considering leaving the medical profession or retiring early due to mental well-being concerns, and 22% said they plan to leave or have considered leaving South Africa due to their mental well-being concerns. Sharma and Cotton, even before this, recognized that the absence of any formal support system for most clinicians in LMICs results in an internalization of emotional and moral distress that can often lead to burnout. In such instances, the healthcare worker becomes the second victim. So what can we do? What can be done? How can we avoid clinicians becoming the second victim? Recently, the idea of resilience has been touted as a response to the problem. Now, resilience refers to the process and the outcome of successfully adapting to difficult or challenging life experiences, according to the definition from the American Psychological Association. It's having the mental, emotional, and behavioral flexibility and ability to adjust to both internal and external demands. In short, it is bounce back ability. So how do we build resilience? Well, this depends on who you ask. Motivational speaker, blindfolded mountain climber, Houdini-style escapist, documentary maker, and adventurer, Todd Sampson, says that the difference between an ordinary brain and an extraordinary brain is all within our reach. We just have to reach for it. Now, I have nothing against Todd Sampson, and I acknowledge that his Earth Hour initiative has done a lot of good in bringing awareness to environmental issues. But claims like the one Todd makes, that anyone with a little motivation can train themselves to do great things, worry me. What worries me more is that Todd is not alone in this kind of thinking. A very quick Google search brings up an extensive array of ways to be or feel better. Take your pick from inspirational books, motivational quotes, exercises for self-improvement, and of course, the ubiquitous self-help apps. There really is something for everyone. As Michael Unger, from whom I first heard about Todd Sampson, puts it, mindfulness, neuroplasticity, trauma-informed cognitive behavioral therapy, psychoanalysis, career coaching, Kripalu yoga, the list of cures for our lack of resilience and related problems is endless. If you are overweight, alone, miserable at work, or crippled by stress or anxiety or depression, there are hordes of gurus and experts chasing you with books and quick fixes. With their advice, guidance, motivation, or inspiration, you can fix your problems. So what is my and Michael Unger's problem with Todd and the like? Are we just grumpy academics, jealous because we're not rich and famous gurus? Possibly, but we're not the only ones who have concerns. In a recent study of employee well-being outcomes from individual-level mental health interventions in the UK, William Fleming found that in response to job demands, interventions are not providing additional or appropriate resources. Fleming used the JDR model, which has at one end the job demands, so the physical, psychological, social, or organizational aspects of the job that require sustained physical, cognitive, and/or emotional support, and at the other end, job resources, the physical, psychological, social, or organizational aspects of the job that have motivating potential, that are functional in achieving work goals, that regulate the impact of job demands, and that stimulate learning and personal growth. In response to the question of whether participants in individual-level mental well-being interventions at work have higher well-being than non-participants, Fleming found that there is no reliable difference in mental well-being across the various outcomes. For the following specific types of interventions, estimates indicate no difference between participants and non-participants. Relaxation practices, time management, coaching, financial well-being programs, well-being apps, online coaching, sleep apps, and sleep events. Volunteering is the only type of intervention to suggest benefit for workers' well-being. Fleming discusses critics of individual-level interventions who suggest that these interventions can produce converse toxic side effects of causing feelings of stress by implying it is an individual problem and self-imposed. And this is my worry about these individual-focused attempts to build resilience. The problems are your problems and yours to fix. And if you fail to fix them, as Unger says, that is your failure, your lack of will, motivation, or strength. Fleming calls for future research to evaluate if individual-level interventions are effective alongside organizational change, or whether improvements in working conditions are in fact a superior alternative. And I would add that we need this research urgently, because we might be spending our limited resources, time, and energies in the wrong place. The proliferation of EAP, Employee Assistance Programs, suggests it's a big and growing industry. Now, I'm not advising that we shouldn't have these programs, but I am worried about relying solely or even mainly on them to fix the problem. Here's why. You can have the best employee wellness center in the world, but if your employees have a manager who doesn't allow them to take time off during their working hours to attend a wellness session, or your unit is so under-resourced that you can't allow a colleague to be absent for an hour or two, what's the point? If we expect people to seek support outside of working hours, which may then entail paying for after-hours transport or for childcare, or losing out on sleep or family time, how is this resource useful to them? What signal are we giving regarding its value? By focusing on changing the worker and not the workplace, we pathologize the individual. Moral distress is your problem or your fault. Unger argues that striving for personal transformation will not make us better when our families, workplaces, communities, healthcare providers, and governments fail to provide us with sufficient care and support. The science shows that all the internal resources we can muster are seldom of much use without a nurturing environment. Furthermore, if these resources are not immediately at hand, we are better off trying to change our world to gain these resources than we are trying to change ourselves. Unger continues that no amount of personal development is going to help you succeed if your employer offers no support. As long as mountains of memos and paperwork accumulate, unrealistic deadlines are imposed, projects are understaffed, jobs are insecure, facilities are poorly maintained, and administrators are incompetent, workers will burn out and fail, whatever their individual beliefs or behaviors. Every serious look at workplace stress has found that when we try to influence workers' problems in isolation, little change happens. Unger and his colleague Linda Theron from the University of Pretoria have developed what they call an unpronounceable account of resilience. It's a biopsychosocial ecological account. They argue that studies of resilience underscore the view that psychological resilience cannot be conceptualized solely on an individual level. That is, although individual cognitions and attributions filter experience of the external world and exert a direct influence on mental health outcomes, studies of resilience show that in context with high exposure to adversity, a precondition for a discussion of resilience, individuals with adequate resources show more resilience than rugged individuals do. They argue that the concept of resilience is best understood as the process of multiple biological, psychological, social, and ecological systems interacting in ways that help individuals to regain, sustain, or improve their mental well-being when challenged by one or more risk factors. Ultimately, their point is that resilience depends just as much on the culturally relevant resources available to stressed individuals in their social, built, and natural environments as it does on individual thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. I want to focus now on a particular kind of resilience, ethical resilience, which is, as Cinder Rushton puts it, the capacity of an individual to sustain or restore their integrity in response to moral adversity. Rushton suggests a number of strategies to cultivate ethical resilience, from fostering self-awareness to participating in transformational learning to contributing to a culture of ethical practice. She calls on us to commit to ethical resilience by taking up opportunities to ask ourselves 3 questions. Who am I being in this moment? How do I want to be known? And am I choosing to act or not act in a way I can live with? I think Rushton is right when she emphasizes that ethical resilience requires dedication, discipline, and compassion in the face of limitations and setbacks, including our own. I think she's right too in pointing to our responsibilities as individuals to consciously and conscientiously examine our views by being self-regulated, by cultivating a balanced mind and heart, by adopting an open, curious, non-reactive mindset, by being clear on our values, and by taking principled action. Being ethical and being ethically resilient is not only, however, an attribute of individuals, an internal ruggedness, but also, and as importantly, a matter of external resources. One of these resources is, as I've alluded to, having a departmental or institutional culture which provides real opportunities for individuals and teams to take up the wellness and support resources that are available. Another is discussions like these, and for those of you in Cape Town, like the Clinical Ethics Forum, which we hold at the Neuroscience Institute every month, which are about creating a space to listen to, engage with, and learn from each other in non-emergency or time-sensitive settings. And these are essential resources, not just an opportunity to get ethics points. Then I think we need additional and continued training in ethical reasoning and critical thinking, because there's more to ethics than autonomy and non-maleficence. In a 2017 article entitled Ethics Education, Preventing Moral Distress and Empathy Decline in Sports Medicine Practice, Kimberly Peer argues that the skill to ethically reason is as important as technical and research-based skills and transcends all aspects of a profession. Just as technical and clinical skills mature with practice, so do ethical skills. She points out that when ethical situations arise that are open to interpretation, the professional and the organizational values may conflict, creating dissonance for the healthcare provider. Driven to serve the patient through empathetic care, the struggle to contrast the patient's needs with those impacted by organizational structure and constraints challenges the professional and the contract with society. This struggle between professional and organizational values creates an optimal environment for moral distress to emerge. Now, I'm not being flippant when I say that there's more to ethics than autonomy and non-maleficence, and I'm not just talking about beneficence and justice. As an example, I think there is much to be gained from virtue ethics, which has come back into fashion among some philosophers, but doesn't often make its way into the ethics syllabus of medical students. Virtue ethics shifts the focus of deliberation from the question, what is the right action, to another question, what kind of people should we be? The attempt to establish a system of ethics on the virtues began with the Greeks. The idea was to begin with character, in particular the ethika arete, or skills of character, that enable humans to flourish. Actions were to be judged based on whether or not they were characteristic of the men, ahem, who exemplify these skills. Right action is defined in terms of the behavior of the virtuous. Similarly, I think the ethics of care offers amazing opportunities to think about the way patients are cared for and the way healthcare professionals care for themselves and for each other. And yet this approach too is largely ignored, except by some members of the nursing profession. The ethics of care, as a distinct ethical framework and theory, gained prominence in the 1980s through Carol Gilligan's influential book, In a Different Voice, Psychological Theory and Women's Development. While the ideas and principles underlying the ethics of care have roots in earlier feminist thought and ethical discussions, It was Gilligan's work that brought this perspective to the forefront of contemporary moral philosophy. Gilligan challenged and expanded upon the work of developmental psychologist and her mentor, Lawrence Kohlberg. She proposed an alternative perspective to Kohlberg's stages of moral development. Hers emphasized care, relationships, and empathy as essential components of ethical reasoning. Kohlberg made the claim that women were less advanced in their moral reasoning abilities than men. The basis for this was that in his research with children, males move further up his 6 stages of moral development than females, with males moving past stage 4, while females, he said, tended to get stuck at stage 3. Kohlberg proposed a dilemma in which a man named Heinz must choose whether or not to steal medicine he can't afford to save the life of his dying wife. The boy participants tended to believe Heinz should take the medicine because the right to life is more important than the right to property. On the other hand, the girl participants tended to think Heinz shouldn't take the medicine because it could land him in jail for stealing, leaving his wife alone when she needs him most. After analyzing Kohlberg's work, Gilligan argued that his findings revealed a gender bias, but not the one Kohlberg had presented. Gilligan proposed that women don't stop developing morally at lower levels than men, but that women's moral development simply continues along a different trajectory from the ethics of justice measured by Kohlberg's scale. She argued that men tend to organize social relationships in a hierarchical order and subscribe to a morality of rights. Females value interpersonal connectedness, care, sensitivity, and responsibility to people. As a man, Kohlberg's scoring criteria gave the interpersonal care orientations of females lower ratings than the principled justice orientation. For Gilligan, it is not that females are less mature than boys, but that men and women follow different voices. Gilligan's other voice in moral reasoning, which could not be found in Kohlberg's propositions, unlike traditional ethics approaches which perceive values, norms, and specific rules, gave rise to what is now called an ethics of care. Such an ethic recognizes relationships and stories which people are involved in and which lead to concern and compassion. The solution to a moral problem does not lie in judging actions on the basis of moral principles, but in intensifying relationships and enhancing empathetic involvement. What underpins Kohlberg's example is that the ethics of justice is impartial. Principles must always be applied in the same way, even if that means it negatively impacts the individual or someone they're close to. Contrast this with the ethics of care, which is not blind to difference, but contextual. Morality isn't based on abstract principles, but on real relationships. According to Gilligan, the logic of other ethical theories posits individuals as opponents in contestations of rights. In this logic, morality consists of a hierarchy of rights and rules used to resolve moral conflicts or problems by weighing claims and judging which is the heavier claim. Images of winning and losing are common. There is potential for violence resulting in part from seeing others as opponents and seeing oneself in contests to obtain or win one's rights and to maintain them. Individual rights are primary and universal. Actual moral dilemmas are conceived of maths problems with humans, and the solution is rationally arrived at so that anyone following reason will arrive at more or less the same conclusion. Abstracting from the interpersonal situation and solving hypothetical dilemmas are means at arriving at objective criteria and objectively deciding who will win in the contest of rights. An underlying premise of the ethics of rights is that individuals are separate from one another. Relationships are viewed as separation. Connection with others is experienced as freely contracted. Now, the ethics of care, as Gilligan outlines it, understands responsibility within a context of relationships or connections. The image she uses is that of a web, which ultimately connects everyone. Responsibility is equated with the need to respond. Individuals need to respond when they recognize that others are counting on them and when they are in a position to help. The ideal of care is an activity of relationship, of seeing and responding to need. The moral imperative is to care, namely to discern and alleviate trouble or suffering in the world. Communication is the means of resolving conflict. Because the activity of care is seen as enhancing both others and the self, and violence is viewed as destructive to all, conflict resolution is non-violent. No specific single principle or set of principles applies to all situations or settles all disputes. Rather, the guiding principle relates responsibility to caring about others and ourselves. The ethics of care conceives of agents as mutually interconnected, vulnerable, and dependent, often in asymmetric ways. Instead of relying on and privileging deduction and abstract reasoning, rational calculations, or rule following, the ethics of care includes taking experiences into account, exercising self-reflection, and taking account of contextual factors, often those related to oppressive and unequal conditions. This approach allows us not only to find new options, which were not clearly discernible before, but also to see and interpret a problem in a new, more plural way. In 2023, Gilligan published In a Human Voice, and even if you're not a feminist, in fact, especially if you're not a feminist, I would urge you to read it. What both virtue and care ethics have in common is that they emphasize the importance of ethics as practical and contextual. Virtue and care ethics allow some emotions, like care or compassion, to be considered moral. On these views, there isn't a dichotomy between reason and emotion, as some emotions can be reasonable, morally appropriate, or even helpful in guiding decisions or actions. Both virtue and care ethics are not only important adjuncts to other ethical frameworks that can support patient care, they can also offer important insights into discussions about the best way to care for the carers themselves. That is, the best way to build ethical resilience. Ultimately, then, I think we need to see ethical resilience, like resilience generally, as not just an individual endeavor. It's not up to you to build your resilience or me to build mine. It's up to us to help build each other's, and this may involve advocating for change in our institutional settings. In arguing for the need to shift the responsibility to develop resilience from the individual to the community, Unger relates a story about the establishment of a dog park in an economically under-resourced area where residents often lived alone in small flats and had limited access to healthcare services. The dog park not only provided opportunities for dogs to socialize and exercise, but also for dog owners to meet and form bonds with other dog owners over a common interest, their pooches. And this had the effect of building community and reducing loneliness. Unger observed that in some instances, dog parks are more effective than a pill. I really do think he's onto something. Thank you.
Heidi, thank you so much for that wonderful talk. And I'd like to start, if I may, by asking you a question. Is there any chance you could put your camera on, Heidi? It's always feels, I'm going to do the same. It's a lot easier to ask you a question when I can see your face. There you are.
Thing.
Hello. I'd like to ask, what do you think the most important interventions are for us as an institution, Groote Schuur UCT, to manage the issue of moral injury, moral distress, particularly where we are now, where we're at in our history with the budget cuts to the Department of Health because of the financial crisis from, the national financial crisis. What do you think we can do, given what we know, to provide some kind of protection against moral injury and moral distress, which, as you've shared, I call the primary stressor of working in medicine? Where would you start?
Sure. So first, I always mean to say this when I talk about moral distress to healthcare providers and practitioners, and that is that I'm acutely aware that as a philosopher, my experience of moral distress is abstract and detached, or at least it is secondhand. I'm not on the wards. I'm not making the tough decisions most of the time when it comes to these kinds of things, and I'm not at least directly affected by the kinds of stresses that you described, Jackie. But I don't think there's a single magic bullet. I think it involves a multiple-pronged approach. I think education, I was having a chat with a clinician friend of mine, and she was talking to interns, and one of them said, after I'd given a presentation on ethical reasoning and ethical theories, those reminded me of when I was in third year. I remember hearing those theories, but they didn't land when I was in third year, but I really wish I could hear about them more now. So I think we have to, on the education side, take a spiraled approach. I think we have to keep coming back to building moral, ethical resilience at different levels and provide different kinds of opportunities for students, for interns, for registrars, and so on. So I would like to see, in terms of education, a really spiraled approach to dealing with this kind of thing. I think that at an institutional level, I think that the clinical ethics forums, the kinds of things we run, which give people the opportunity to look at real cases that happen in real context that we're familiar with, but not at the time that a decision needs to be made. Because I think the pressure of making those decisions in the moment is an additional stressor. So I think ethical reasoning, moral reasoning, ethical resilience is a muscle that has to be exercised. And so clinical ethics forums, discussion groups like these, like ours at UCT, provides opportunities for people to think about ethical issues, to talk to each other about ethical dilemmas, and to come up with ways of reasoning through them that allow people to sleep at night. A third thing I think is that, and that's related to that, is to have something like a clinical ethics committee in as many sites as possible. And a clinical ethics committee, there's a lot of research to say how they should be set up and where they should be set up and how they should be run. And a clinical ethics committee really takes responsibility for those unbelievably tough decisions that have to get made. And it takes the responsibility away from the individual clinician or the individual team of clinicians and allows some distance from the problem. So whether it's with clinical ethics specialists, with bioethicists, with philosophers, with psychiatrists, psychologists, and so on, I think a clinical ethics committee is essential. And finally, if I can just have one more minute to add to this, I think admitting that there's a problem is the first real step. And I don't mean that by everybody talking about austerity and everybody talking about the effects that austerity is having. I mean admitting there's a problem personally by saying, I'm not feeling okay in this environment. So having that vulnerability, having that space to admit that I don't know all the answers, and that sometimes I feel stressed and that sometimes I feel anxious, because I think that normalizing moral distress is the opposite of pathologizing moral distress. And so I think if we normalize it, we live in a morally distressful society. We live in a morally distressing healthcare setting. And I think admitting that things are tough for individuals is a way of connecting and sharing that vulnerability. So I think it's a multi-pronged approach. Thanks, Jackie.
So I think though, Heidi, I agree that we need to be vulnerable enough within ourselves and with each other to share that we're finding something difficult and that we don't know all the answers and that we are in fact finding something distressing. But in order for that to happen, we first need to talk about the issue of the culture of medicine, which often does not allow for us to be vulnerable and to say that we don't know what to do, or that we're stuck, or that we're finding something distressing. So in some ways, I think that the issues that you spoke of are important, that we need to be able to make these decisions collaboratively. But often, of course, what we see is that individuals are feeling under some kind of internalized pressure to make those decisions themselves, because in medicine, we are taught that knowing everything, being right, knowing is an incredibly important part of our identity, having answers. And it's not just, of course, colleagues that put us under that pressure of being the knower, but if our patients do too. And I think what is incredibly important for senior people in particular to model is that they don't have answers to whatever clinical scenario it may be, and to say that I need to go and do some more reading, or actually I would like your help to make this decision, please. I'm feeling a little bit stuck here. And to junior staff in particular to model how we think through answering complex questions. And also to stay when we're stuck, when we're unable to resolve this within ourselves with what we know. But that really will require a significant shift in our culture. I wonder if you have any comments on that.
So it's really interesting. I find I grew up in a family of one half were philosophers and one half were cardiologists. So I find this, I mean, it's not surprising I've ended up where I am, but I think philosophy is, as a culture, philosophers, well, some philosophers, well, let me just speak for myself. Philosophy is about a quest for knowledge, and we recognize that we will never attain absolute certainty. Everything is contested. Ethics itself is contested. And so I think you're absolutely right. There is this difference between someone from my training, where we are learned to question everything and to not have the kind of certainty that science claims to have. Whereas there is a difference in the medical profession. And I think that patients need, or at least think they need, that kind of certainty. And I think that comes from the history of the profession. So I'm fascinated by the history of medicine and the shifts that have occurred in the history of medicine. And if we go back to principles, which I said I wasn't really going to talk about because there's more than ethics than principles. But if we think about the relationship between autonomy and paternalism. So in the past, doctor knew everything, patient knew nothing. Doctor didn't feel the need to tell patient anything. And I'm going back to the very distant past, so nobody needs to be offended in this setting. I don't mean in contemporary times. I'm talking about the Hippocratic era. And so as long as the doctor was motivated by good, then the patient trusted and accepted. And I think there's been a massive shift. And I think it's a good shift as information has become more available, as access has become more broad. I think patients have much more autonomy and ought to have autonomy. And while I don't think that patients should be rushing off to find Dr. Google's second opinion every time they don't agree with their treating physician, I do think that we need to acknowledge that that balance of power has shifted. But what's interesting, aside from my cat joining the discussion, what's interesting is that the balance of power has shifted in that I think patients have gained autonomy and gained power in the relationship. And while I'm not suggesting that doctors or clinicians or healthcare professionals in general should lose power, I think there needs to be the recognition that they are not expected to know everything, that nobody in the complex world in which we function today, nobody can know everything all of the time. And I think that comes in part from recognizing that medicine is not just a science, it's an art. And with art comes the ability to see that the slightest difference between patient A and patient B is going to mean that the same treatment and the same diagnosis is going to have a different outcome. And so that certainty, I think, is almost inappropriate. And it's a pressure, it's a burden that clinicians put on themselves that I think needs to change. And I think we need to stop putting that pressure on medical students. We need to stop telling medical students when they ask a question that it's a stupid question, or why don't they know that, or they learned that 2 years ago and they should remember that, or on their first day in an obs and gynae rotation that they should magically know where the 5mm syringe is kept in the unit that they haven't ever been in before. I think we need to give ourselves, and I mean that as human beings, but I think clinicians need to give themselves a break and not have the expectation they have on themselves, because that culture shift comes from within. It's not going to happen without. Patients are not going to tell doctors, you don't need to know everything. It's the clinicians who need to alleviate that pressure on themselves and on each other.
I mean, a part of that culture shift is a sense of real authentic connection with the people that we work with. And I think that is possible, but it is something that we all need to work at, because I think authentic connection with our colleagues, and therefore being able to feel safe enough to have difficult conversations and to be able to access those so that you can resolve these complex issues, means that you feeling psychologically safe in that environment. And okay, so there's another term. What does that mean, to feel psychologically safe? Well, that you feel seen, that you feel heard, that you feel confident enough that you can speak up and that your voice will be respected, that you may ask questions without being belittled or put down, for example, and that you feel a sense of connection with the people around you, a sense of belonging. And I think a really important step to managing moral injury and moral distress is not only about having the forums available in which we can take difficult cases to experts, for example. It's also about working on teams in the tiny little team. So it could be the hematology department or the consultation liaison, my division, like working on those connections between those people so that environments become psychologically safe, so that more questions are asked of the senior people than, for example, the senior people firing questions at more junior people. I think that there is a significant amount of momentum being built internationally, and in actual fact, a number of our most respected journals, such as Nature and The Lancet, have been talking about this issue of psychological safety and the toxicity of medical culture. And these publications have been happening within the last year. So I think there's an increasing recognition that the mental well-being of clinicians needs to be protected, not only from moral injury, moral distress, but from the difficult environment that medicine brings. So I think these issues actually go hand in hand. And I think the idea of becoming more moral injury resilient is about feeling padded and connected by your team. And that sense of being able to endure incredibly difficult clinical outcomes or clinical decisions or clinical pressures is significantly enhanced by that sense of belonging and that sense of connection. I mean, there is also a really fascinating body of literature and research emerging around the topic of loneliness within medical culture and medical settings. And and how that impacts, again, all of these things are very connected. It impacts things like resilience and feeling connection, patient and decision making. And in actual fact, there's also evidence to suggest that lonely clinicians don't deliver particularly, aren't working at their premium, as good as they can be, because they aren't feeling connected to the environment and to the patients around them. So belonging and connection is also, I think, an incredibly important part of addressing the traumas about working within healthcare. I don't see any other questions coming up. Or hang on, is there one that's just come up now? In a setting where the ideal scenario of having clinical ethics committee is not really feasible, is there a way colleagues could assist each other in this regard? Will it help? Oh, okay.
So I think Jackie, you've hit on something that Jackie and I are particularly I hate the word passionate, but we are particularly passionate about. You can have a clinical ethics committee that's formalized and that has terms of reference and that has rosters and administrators to take minutes of meetings and all sorts of things. And that's wonderful. And I mean, that's the gold standard. But you can also have, and I think this is where Jackie's talking about, if you develop the kinds of connections with people, you can talk to people in your environment. And this is where care ethics comes in, and build the kinds of relationships with people where colleagues can assist each other, where you can pick up the phone or water. We don't have enough of those water tanks where people, or kettles. Water tanks and kettles are really important opportunities to build connection and build relationships. We all seem to have little coffee pods in our offices, or a kettle in our kitchen that's far, far away, or we go downstairs and grab a coffee and run back up to our offices. And I think that opportunity to talk to our colleagues and to say, do you know someone? I'm really battling with this question, this consideration. Do you know someone I can talk to? And you may not know the person, but you may know the person who knows the person. And I do think that you can have the gold standard of clinical ethics committees with institutional mandates and all sorts of structures. And ideally, that's what we want. But in smaller settings, you can have those kinds of things if you've built the relationship with people, and if you are prepared to be vulnerable with people and say, I don't know, or I'm not coping with this, or I'm struggling with this, or I did this, but I think I could have done it differently. What do you think? And so that's the one thing. I think that you could take a tiered approach. You could have a really sort of small committee. Even, I'm not even sure I'd call it a committee. I mean, for a while, Jackie and other colleagues, Jantina and I, were sort of ad hoc group that people could call on when they had difficult cases. And that's evolving into, hopefully, a clinical ethics committee. I want to go back to something that was said earlier, and it's about the caring environment that we need to create, and about the psychological safety in our workplace. And I think that it requires a Copernican revolution. I mean, it literally requires us to change the way we see the world. And we cannot continue in this world where it's the same old, because the world is not the same old. And I think that the lessons learned from COVID, just as an outsider, not as a clinician dealing with COVID, but people were beyond their wits' end. People were burnt out beyond burnt out. People were expected to cope with things that we'd never considered coping with. And yet, I think COVID built, in some cases, the most amazing, and Jackie can talk about this, but built the most amazing connections between people, because people could do nothing else but admit that things were tough. And I think that if we imagine our world, we're trying to we're trying to teach our medical students, and I'm very involved in medical education, so this is what I always come back to. If we teach medical students the same way we've been teaching them for the last 300 years, but the world changes, we're not going to get them fit for purpose. We need to think about what the world of work looks like now. It looks different. And I'm going to say this in a probably politically insensitive or incorrect way. But medicine in South Africa 50 years ago, 100 years ago, there were no black or brown faces. There were no women. The world is different. But if we teach the way we've always taught, we are not producing students who are fit for purpose. And those students are the ones who become the interns, who become the registrars, who become the burnt out clinicians later on. And I think that we need to think about how those clinicians then interact with the world. And they can do it in a pro-social way, and they can do it in an antisocial way. And my concern is that the antisocial way is so bad for the clinicians themselves that we then get into this loop of constant kind of antisocial behavior from the top that filters down to the bottom, and it models, this is what you have to do to cope. And I don't think that's doing justice. I don't think that's doing justice to the profession of healthcare. I think the profession of healthcare has in the name care. And a colleague of mine talks about his sense that healthcare workers or healthcare practitioners are immensely good at providing care to their patients, but absolutely shocking at providing self-care. And he says he sees this all the time, and it resonated with me. And that's why I think the approach of care ethics, the idea that we are connected, that none of us are meant to know everything all the time, is the right approach, as opposed to a kind of Oracle of Delphi where we know everything, we do everything, and everything we do is right. That was a long response.
Brilliant response. There is a question about assisting healthcare workers who are isolated but in private practice and without connections. So there actually really is a pretty good model for this. It's called a sort of peer support group. So there are a couple of them that I know of. You know, for example, I know of a group of psychiatrists, for example, that pay a psychologist for a session, but that's, you know, one psychologist fee for an hour divided by 5. And they meet either, depending on the time or the finances, they meet with a psychologist as a group of colleagues, not friends, not family, but as a group of colleagues, again, to talk through difficult things. Sometimes it's about cases, sometimes it's about difficulties in the environment. Sometimes they may not even be working in the same office, but they can certainly share similar stories and create that sense of belonging. So there is a really good model for that. And in actual fact, there's definitely an appetite from psychologists to support such ventures, particularly since COVID, where the distress that healthcare workers were under was highlighted. So COVID was a horrific and traumatic experience, but at least the issue around caring for healthcare workers became more prominent. So there are definitely psychologists out there who will take this up. If everybody is very disconnected from each other and quite far away, of course, online options, but I would say that having such connections online is a poor substitute for face-to-face meetings. I mean, I think that's the way real connections are made, when you can be in an environment with other colleagues and feel what they're feeling in a way without them needing to say something. What does their body language say? What does their facial expression say? What does it feel like to be around this person, and what are we feeling together? So I would really recommend that being done face to face, but it's been incredibly helpful for those clinical teams that gather in that way, to create a sort of sense of belonging and sense of support.
Jackie, if
Jackie,
I
I
can
think Vernon
quickly
had a question. Yeah.
jump in here, maybe more of a comment and question all in one. Thank you very much, Heidi, for a great talk, and thank you, Jackie, for what you are doing in your work to try and help manage a lot of this, I think, both moral injury and moral residue that's stuck with people post-COVID. I want to be provocative and say that perhaps in some ways, COVID might have been easier from a moral injury perspective than what we currently see, in the sense that at the time, there was a kind of joint responsibility taking and protocolizing of how we're going to manage, how we're going to triage, how we're going to make decisions. Now that we're dealing with resource constraints, financial constraints specifically, finding the golden mean between purely utilitarian efficiencies versus moving further and further away from what we used to do for patients one, and now switch over to, let's say, palliative care, where previously we would have helped. And couple that with the responsibility still in this situation being placed on the individual doctors or units, whereas with COVID, there was maybe a more centralizing of responsibility within this hierarchical system. The responsibility is back on our shoulders. This is not a state of emergency officially. I think the loss of agency that people feel now might be more than the sheer loss of agency during COVID. So it's provocative. I may be completely wrong, but I'd like to hear what you think.
I actually don't think
Yeah.
it's provocative, and I absolutely agree with you. There was again, I find it difficult to use positive words when I talk about the pandemic, given the layers and layers of trauma that all of us experienced, our patients and us. But what COVID allowed us to do was with patients and us to collaborate against a common enemy or a common pathogen. And the enemy and the pathogen were known. We were able to join with our patients again, third wave aside, with the anti-vaxxers. That was a different issue to navigate. But other than the sort of anti-vaxxers, they felt that there was a sense of joining and that the enemy was known. And there was a pathogen. I think that in some ways that did make the moral injury and moral distress easier to navigate. It wasn't and the formulas that we had were helpful, although I would argue certainly didn't answer all of the difficult questions that we had, all the scenarios that we faced. But I do agree with you, Vernon, and I do agree that in some ways, I think we're in for even harder times when it comes to the particular issue of moral injury and moral distress. I think with COVID also, all of us moved forward together into the unknown together against a pathogen. I think here with the different sort of cuts in budget, it's going to impact different teams differently. I also worry about those that are impacted more by budget cuts and the othering that happens in medicine when you sort of, my team and I are this and you are other, that there may even be conflict between those who have more and less resources, whether it be hospital versus hospital or team versus team. But I think that the other problem for me is that there isn't a joining this time of us and patients. In actual fact, I'm really uncertain about how much patients know about what is happening. But also the sense of during COVID, where we were moving forward together against a pathogen, we are now moving backwards from a position where we could deliver intervention 1, 2, and 3. Now we've only got number 1. So I think I agree, and I am deeply concerned, as is Heidi, and I would really like to ask for all of your support in setting up a clinical ethics committee here at Groote Schuur. And for those of you who work in other hospitals, please start reaching out to folks who you think have the expertise, and set them up in all of your individual hospitals. Heidi and I are trying to work on a how to set up one of these committees. In actual fact, we're meeting with Tygerberg tomorrow. Tygerberg actually have a clinical ethics committee. We do not. And we'd very much like, for those of you who work at UCT and Groote Schuur, to add your voice into the mix. We need a forum that just people on the ground, just boots on the ground, can phone and say, I can't make this decision. This is too difficult for me. I'm struggling with this. Help me, please. And we need to be able to respond timeously, not at the next Monday meeting, which may be days away from a decision that imminently needs to be made. I actually think we even need an on-call system to help people navigate difficult decisions at risk of causing moral injury and moral distress. And we need that at Groote Schuur. We don't have that. And for those of you who have that at your hospitals, wow, amazing. But if you do not, it's something we should need to be making noise about. We should be making noise about the things that cause us distress. An enormous amount of noise. We cannot change the money that comes to our different hospitals. We can't change that. But we can, and I guess part of the distress is that we're losing some of our autonomy. Like these beautiful things that we've built, we're losing these beautiful things. And it feels like a massive assault to the autonomy we have as clinicians, the autonomy that we had to choose treatments that we felt were best with our patients, in joining with our patients and saying to our patients, these are the choices you have. This is what I have for you. We're losing that. And that is an enormous assault on our autonomy. And I would urge you all that I would say that urge is not the right word. I'm thinking here. I would say that we have some autonomy here. And I think that's the only way to be, to maintain that we do still have autonomy. But how do we use that autonomy? And I think we need to be making an enormous amount of noise that not about give us more money, please, but allow us to create these spaces where we can support each other, where we can help each other to make difficult decisions, and where we can join together and care for each other. Without this, I am afraid of what is coming. I truly am, in terms of the health, the well-being of our colleagues, who are people that we care deeply for. I am deeply concerned about the people that I care for who work here with me.
And just to add, I mean, I don't think it's provocative. And in my former life, when I was more of a political philosopher than a moral philosopher, we talked about the experience of South Africa during apartheid and having this enemy, the enemy of apartheid to fight, and it galvanized people from all different kind of sectors of society, and in and out and overseas and local and young and old and everything else. And there was that clear enemy. And then what happens with kind of, whether it's post-apartheid or decolonization or whatever, is that enemy dissipates, and it becomes much less easy to know what the target of our anger is, what the target of our frustration is. And I think that's a worry. And I think whereas COVID was our colonization or our apartheid, and everyone knew this had to be, in the moral warfare terminology, this had to be beaten. We had to get on top of COVID. I think it's much harder when there isn't an obvious enemy. But I also think that the obvious enemy is is austerity. And there's nothing I think you're right, Jackie, we can't manufacture more money. We can't find more money in places. But what we can do is not tear each other apart in not being able to identify that enemy. I think what's happening is that we're taking it out on each other. And I think that Vernon mentioned utilitarianism, and I think that utilitarianism can give a very clear answer of why there is a need to protect healthcare providers, healthcare workers. Because if we lose healthcare workers, it's going to get worse for patients. I mean, that's the reality. It's going, more people are going to have to do more work. They're not going to be able to do the work, and the outcomes are going to be worse. So even on a utilitarian, even on a very rational, very objective account, it doesn't make sense to do things in the way that they have been done, given that the context has changed. And you're right, we can't change the money situation. We can't make more, but we can change the way we relate to people. And I think that's really fundamental. And this is the Copernican revolution, that autonomy is important, but we have to recognize in a context where we have less autonomy, we have to supplement it with something. And that something is care, that something is recognition, that sometimes people need to be held in a kind of workspace. And that's what care ethics does. It says that, like, I'm going to hold you for now, and then when you're strong again, you'll hold me for in that situation. And I think there is a moral imperative on healthcare workers to change the way they think about their role. And unfortunately, it's like you can't use an army to fight a war that's in the air. And so if we go back to that moral warfare, I think the weapons we're using to keep sanity among healthcare, among doctors, are not the right weapons. Doing the way we've done before is not the right way to go.
Thanks, Heidi. I do think, and my concern is that a transformation might also be taking place in our own minds. That because of the continued and ongoing distress, moral injury, making decisions purely based on resources and the availability of resources, we are shaping the minds of our doctors and our medical students into becoming progressively more and more utilitarian, which in itself has got a large range of dangers. And in my opinion, it's one of the lowest levels at which to function. In very simple terms, we could just say, well, if we really want to be utilitarian, we'll just stop treating any rare disease or anything that costs us a lot of money, and we'll just focus on HIV and TB. And the reality is, as leaders, we need to think, while we are at it, there needs to be a continuous awareness of what we are busy with, and that the way we're doing things is not necessarily correct. And I think opening these opportunities for conversation, challenging the status quo, and not just succumbing to whatever the going dogma of the day is, and to say these are emergency measures, unnatural for unnatural times. This is not a way to live. Otherwise, as human beings, we're going to lose our sense of community, of solidarity with the weakest that happens to have some congenital heart defect or some problem that might need to cost a little bit more money. And I'm very worried about what's happening to us, and especially people for whom this is going to be their normal. They've not lived through periods where it was different, and they might become naturalized to a very, very abnormal way of thinking.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that that's fundamental, and I keep coming back to it. I think that medicine as an art, the profession, is creative. The idea is about creative solutions to problems, and I think that's really what you're saying, Vernon, is we have to be more creative. And I don't mean that in a sort of pay as you wow kind of fashion. I mean creative in the way we engage with people. I think part of the problem, I'm from an outsider's perspective, is that there are these groups of people or these teams. So it's my team versus your team. It's management versus the doctors. It's doctors versus the nurses. It's patients versus the thises. And I think that in itself is very, very dangerous in times like this. I think that othering that Jackie was mentioning is really, we need to watch out for that, because that's a kind of typical response, but it's a very dangerous response.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is why having conversations like this is important. And I think that weekly conversations within teams need to happen. Vernon, I've actually written a paper on what I think should happen to look after doctors in the future based on my experience of looking after them during COVID. It was published in an ethics journal. It's a very long name, but I'll send it to you. But I really think that within each team, we need, especially, you know, as the senior people or leaders, we need to make these conversations happen. We need to hold on to, us as senior people, need to hold on to the way of medicine, which is orientated towards healing a patient with whatever we have, not you're discounted because you have a rare disease. I will look after you to the best of my ability with what I have, would be the approach, not to discount you, but to still be orientated towards your health and well-being with the resources that I have. You know, it's a bit of a mind shift thing, which I think we have to model, we have to teach, we have to talk about this. We're not going to be doing as many transplants as we have been able to do in the past. But instead of the mindset of, well, I can't transplant you, so I must discount you, it's, I cannot transplant you, but I'm still orientated to your health to the best of my ability. This is what I can do for you. And it may be around communication and talking to families and managing pain, etc., etc. But it's not, I think my concern is the idea of discounting people we cannot save. But that isn't the way of medicine. The way of medicine isn't about life or death. It is about being, and it is about being in this world with the best health that you can, with the resources that we have. But I can see the slippery slope you're talking about. I really, really can. And I think that we, as the sort of people who are aware of these issues, we need to be making noise about having spaces to have these conversations, insisting upon it, in fact, because if we are put in this position of having to make these horrific decisions, we must be given the tools that we know work to preserve some of our sanity. We know what works from COVID, like we know what didn't work and we know what works. In this hospital, we know what works and what doesn't work to look after each other. And I think we need to be absolutely insisting that we have that. What I'm afraid of is that we have unlearned many of the lessons that we learned during COVID. And again, please make noise for each and every hospital to have a clinic ethics committee. It's very different from a clinical governance committee. That's not the same. A clinical ethics committee. I think we're probably going to have to wrap it up there, because Vernon has asked.
I just want to quickly comment on your last comment, because I think this is really very important, and I think it's worldview shaping for everyone. And I see one of the younger doctors has just made a comment like that, and for me, there's a reminder. I really liked what both of you said earlier: the importance of community, the social cohesion within your team, small teams, etc. And that is extremely powerful. the risk of not doing that is that each of us will crawl into our corner, hide ourselves away, lock the door, and become isolated. But there's also another danger that I think one shouldn't forget, and that is that we can fall for the temptation of tribalism, where because we're in survival mode, that it's just me and my team, and I'm often tempted towards that. I'll do everything for my team, which I'm doing, or trying to do at least, but we are part of a larger system, and there should be this interconnectedness that Heidi spoke about earlier that we need to recognize as key. And these are not disconnected, well, no pun intended, but these are not disconnected from each other. Individually, we've got our injuries. As a group and as individuals, we try to cope with them, but we're part of a larger whole. And I think for that reason, groups like these clinical ethics meetings or committees should probably be as broadly representative as possible, so that it does not become a place where we're just all saying the same thing to each other, but where everybody on all levels of let's call it the hierarchy, hear and take a share of the burden of responsibility, of the decision-making, the difficulties that should not be carried by healthcare workers alone. Anyways, I think there was an important comment by Sister Annie as well. I've not taken up a lot of time here. And then I will just have a quick advertisement at the end, if that's okay with you, Jackie.
Yes, sure. Do you think involving advocacy groups for different patient groups could be useful? Oh, that's a difficult one. I think that, part of advocacy is, of course, is to say that we deserve, we must have these resources. So that's an important part of advocacy. But I think, which I think advocacy groups for particular conditions have always been really good at. But I think there's a new role for these advocacy groups now, and that is in increasing access to palliative care, for example, increasing education about what does it mean if the resources in our environments are limited, or you don't have access to this. And yeah, so I think advocacy groups are very good for competing for more resources for their patient group. But if there are none, if there just aren't any resources to compete for anymore, what is the role of advocacy groups? Perhaps in facilitating a better understanding for the patients about where we're at in this time in history, for advocating for more palliative care within that particular condition, and perhaps also for establishing better connections between the patient groups and the doctors who serve them.
Yeah,
so that
and
there's a better understanding of where we're at and what it is that we as a unit, I mean, the way of medicine sees the doctor-patient unit, that where we as a unit are at. It's not an us versus them scenario, but in our journey together, doctor-patient, this is where we're at. I think, yeah, I don't know if that makes any sense. Yeah.
And I'd just like to add that I think, Jackie, your point is that when we talk about resources, we need to be very clever now about what we mean by resources, because resources are no longer just the physical resources. Communication is a resource, education is a resource, and those things are happening anyway, but we can do them better, we can do them differently. And I think that that's fundamental, that when we don't have the physical resources, taking that time to think about different conceptions of resources can fill some of the plugs, can become some of the plugs for those gaps in resources. And then the one thing I just wanted to add before you do your ad, Vernon, and I think before Bridget probably wraps up, is that on the positive, I think South Africans as a unit, as a population, are incredibly resilient. And I'm a sucker for Sky News for all the wrong reasons. But when I see what's going on in the rest of the world, and whether it's the NHS or the Canadian health system or other health systems, I mean, we do seem to have the resilience to cope on so many of those systemic levels that I think in other settings people wouldn't cope. Now, that doesn't mean we should have to cope. I think we need to be careful that we don't just say, oh, well, this is what happens in our kind of setting. But it means we can use resources differently. And I think the resource that Jackie's pointed to the whole afternoon is to use the power of our voices to say we need to do things differently. So thank you for the opportunity to let me use mine.
Thanks, Heidi. Vernon, can I hand over to you to do your advertising?
Thanks, Jackie. That's great. And while Bridget is sharing a screen, can I just say a big thank you to you, Jackie, for chairing this session, to Heidi for a wonderful presentation. I think the fact that we're having this conversation already in itself is to some extent maybe a starting point for a debriefing where we are acknowledging that we are all in the same boat. We're all struggling with similar issues, and it's not just something one or two people are dealing with. And I really think this was a very, very good topic. So also thanks to the Blood SA team and Bridget and Estelle and Khardin and everybody who's been looking after this program so well, and including a wonderful topic like this. Just want to remind everyone of the SASMO SASETS conference, the Transplantation Society conference, and the Medical Oncology ones very soon in Cape Town. Please come and join us. Next slide. We also have the International Donor Registry Conference and WMDA meeting that you can see the deadline to submit there, but the meeting is only in June. Next one. HemOnc this year will be in Cape Town as well, 13 to 15 September. It is already looking like a fantastic program. I'm so excited. This year is really going to bring in the lab teams, the transfusions societies and groups, the clinicians. It's going to be a cohesive, collaborative HemOnc. We're very excited about it. So please put it in your diaries. Make sure you go online and get signed up. And Bridget, was that it?
That's all, Prof.
Fantastic. When you leave the room, don't, it's only going to take you 30 seconds to just give a little bit of feedback on your session. We really appreciate that always, and make sure that you get more good stuff in the future. If I say me, it's actually not me. It's all the wonderful people that are doing the logistics and organization. I just get to talk a lot. So, but we say a big thank you. And again, thank you to Heidi, our speaker, and Jackie for sharing. And for Bridget, you must get your photo on this PowerPoint. Thank you very much. You do so much. Thanks, everyone. Have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.